The Tevin Jenkins situation in Chicago seems to have completely fallen apart. We went from playing with the backups to not practicing at all to now trade talks with other teams.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen each and every day. On the show today, we got to catch up and figure out what's going on with this Teven Jenkins situation. The Bears offensive tackle has been kind of one of the main storylines of training camp for him not being involved exactly with the team. The team itself has kind of downplayed it and talked around it a little bit, but finally news comes out on Monday that the Bears are in trade talks for Teven Jenkins. And with the speed that news can move during training camp like this, perhaps by the time you hear this podcast, maybe Teven Jenkins will already be traded. But as the time I'm recording this, it's just that there has been trade talks. So we'll talk about those trade rumors. We'll talk about some of the loosely reported concerns about Teven Jenkins, perhaps some maturity questions, and we'll go back and find where there may have been crumbs of this along the way, largely from Teven Jenkins' college coach, Mike Gundy from Oklahoma State. And some of the things he said when the Bears first drafted Teven Jenkins that maybe we didn't fully see as red flags at the time, but with hindsight, looks pretty bright red from here. Then we'll kind of wrap up looking at what does happen from here. What might this look like? What might his future be? Is it salvageable at this point? And what kind of trade compensation could you expect for a player like this? And so much more to get to. It really feels like that scene in Anchorman, or if you haven't seen the movie, you've certainly seen the GIF where Will Ferrell is sitting at the desk in the office with about a half-empty beer, leaning back with his shirt, his tie undone a little bit, and he goes, "Boy, that sure escalated quickly. Wow, yeah, that got a hand real fast." Of course, everyone else is in the office like with a beer, and one's holding his beer up to his head because they'd just been in a fight. Right? It really escalated quickly. We were careful on this podcast that during OTAs, Teven Jenkins gets what feels like sort of like a demotion, but the team kind of plays it off and says, all these guys are rotating with the starters and with the backups. Teven Jenkins playing with the backups, Braxton Jones getting some time with the starters, and maybe it's something to keep an eye on, but the pads weren't even on yet, so it wasn't really a full way to evaluate this offensive line. And my feeling was always, let's see when they get these pads on, when Teven Jenkins can actually hit somebody, and then we'll see how this offensive tackle depth chart plays out. But we're not going to get, it doesn't seem like, to that opportunity for Teven Jenkins to get those pads on. Ian Rappaport from the NFL Network tweeting out on Monday that the Bears have received calls and have held trade talks centered around offensive tackle Teven Jenkins. The former second-round pick has drawn interest based on his potential. He called it a situation to watch. So that tweet coming out would seem to indicate open for business, right? It's not like some team was going to just sweep in right away and pull out a quick deal here, but this is the Bears maybe putting out there and saying, hey, we've got some interest. Let's see if we can drive up this bidding price for him a little bit. The problem is, teams are going to be digging into why the Bears are so interested or could be interested in trading a second-year player, of last year's 39th overall pick, who was a starting caliber offensive tackle and expected to compete to start this season, and we're still sort of expecting to be that quality of a player, a very talented player coming out of the NFL draft. But there's been some murmurings and now some reporting from Adam Kaplan from ESPN and NBC Sports Chicago. I wanted to play just a quick snippet of something he reported on his YouTube channel. It's The Recap is the show that he does. He does a great job. I mean, everybody loves, well, most people love David Kaplan. Go check out his work. And here's what he was reporting on Teven Jenkins.
Tevin Jenkins missed his third consecutive practice today. And from what I'm hearing, it is not a serious injury. What I'm hearing is there is a high level of disconnect between Tevin and the new coaching staff, especially Chris Morgan, the new offensive line coach. That means you have a highly immature player who's got a lot of talent. As one person who would know, close to the team, said to me, he's their most talented lineman, but I'm also hearing he's wildly immature. And so this is on Teven Jenkins to grow the hell up. But the Bears, how many people do you have in your front office that work on culture and work on player relations? You also have to figure this out, because if this kid has that much ability, you better get it unlocked, because your offensive line right now certainly isn't a strength of this football team.
Kaplan there, really the first and only person that I've seen yet actually reporting immaturity questions about Teven Jenkins. There's been speculation from everyone, but this is the first thing to sort of have a name on it. And I also really appreciate how David there is smart and wise enough, right, to see the bigger picture there of, yes, it looks very bad on Teven Jenkins as a second-year player to not come in and potentially, clash with the coaching staff in this way and perhaps lead to his exit from the team. It's a very poor reflection on Teven Jenkins. But David wisely makes the point there, too, that the Bears also can perhaps bear some of the responsibility here, that you would hope that when you have a player this talented with this much potential that can still be a contributor at a major position of need and importance for Justin Fields, that it's also on them to figure out ways to kind of work this out and to meet Teven Jenkins somewhere in the middle. That I don't think either group can receive 100% of the blame, and we don't know enough details to really properly distribute blame. I'm guessing it probably isn't a 50-50 thing, but we don't have the details yet. We just know that perhaps there's some maturity question marks there and some inability to properly get along with the coaching staff. Maybe it's about doing what he wants them to do. It kind of came a little bit out of nowhere for me of like where is all this coming from Teven Jenkins? We knew he was sort of a tough-nosed physical offensive lineman. This felt like it was coming out of nowhere. But when you go back and listen to his college coach, Mike Gundy, talking about him when he was drafted by the Bears last year, you can see some of the inklings of this along the way that maybe we didn't pay close enough attention to at the time. We'll go back and listen to what the Oklahoma State coach said and why maybe some of these red flags were there all along next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is powered by Built Bars, the makers of the world's best tasting protein bars ever. They got Built Bars, Built Puffs, Built Granola. Now, everything they come out with has just been so good. It's one of my guilty pleasures that I don't have to feel guilty about. Right now, they have a chocolate cookie dough Built Puff with cookie dough chunks in it. It's like a chocolate-covered marshmallow with cookie dough. It's an elite combination. And all Built Bar protein bar products are low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. It is the best of both worlds. It's like 150 calories, but it's got 17 grams of protein and like 5 grams of sugar. It sounds like it's too good to be true, but trust me, when you taste it, you'll believe it. Head on over to Built.com and use our promo code LOCKED15 and you're going to get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15, LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. Coming out of the draft, we knew that Teven Jenkins was, more of a soft-spoken offensive lineman. He puts the glasses on and he almost looked nerdy when you just see him from like the neck up. But we saw not only on tape at Oklahoma State, but even on the field during Jenkins' rookie season that he had a mean streak. He could hit guys and he could be physical and he can bulldoze offensive or defensive linemen on the field. And most importantly, we saw him stand up for Justin Fields when he got hit late, to the point where Jermaine Ifedi came over and tried to stand him down, which was something we didn't like. We liked Teven Jenkins finally being aggressive and stepping up for his quarterback the way other offensive linemen didn't. And so we thought Jenkins was going to be then a good enforcer and maybe a tone setter for this offensive line moving forward. It was something that this offseason, Ryan Poles said he wanted this offensive line to be a little bit more tough and a little bit more physical. And at the time, that seemed like what Teven Jenkins was going to be able to provide. that maybe the previous coaching staff wasn't unleashing enough of that physicality from him, and that they were trying to hold that down, and that the new regime would want more of that from Teven Jenkins. But now this idea of some of this immaturity and not exactly wanting to do what the coaching staff says pushes up against that. And like I said before, it seemed to come out of nowhere, but you listen back to Mike Gundy, the Oklahoma State head coach. He met with Bears media virtually over Zoom back when the team drafted Teven Jenkins in the second round last season. And of course, every college coach is going to come into those press conferences and say glowing things about their player because it's good for recruiting, and it's, you don't want to come up and just like trash the guy. But tucked in between a lot of the positive things that Mike Gundy said about Teven Jenkins were some little blips that at the time you might not have thought was a big deal, but given the context and where we are now, it turns out maybe Mike Gundy was not warning us, but giving us some clues that something like this was within the realm of possibility. So I went through Mike Gundy's 12, 15-minute press conference thing, and I put together a super cut of some of his answers about Teven Jenkins. So clearly I edited out other pieces here. There was a lot of it where he says great things. He said he thought Teven Jenkins could be the best offensive lineman in this draft class, that he gets to Chicago, he's got all the talent in the world to be the most talented player. It was not Mike Gundy throwing Teven Jenkins on the bus the whole time. So I do encourage you to go back and listen to the whole thing when you get a second. It's on the Chicago Bears YouTube channel. It's the Mike Gundy press conference. But here I cut the specific moments where he talked about how Teven Jenkins needs to be challenged and needs motivation, and didn't really start really going after it until about the full 12 months before he was drafted. Hear from the coach himself.
I used to joke with Teven when we were in the weight room, and there'd be 60 or 80 players in there and a coaching staff, and I would ask him, I said, Teven, there's one guy in this room that could be worth $30 or $40 million someday. And he would look at me and I would say, do you know who that is? And he would say no. And I said, it's you, Teven. That's who it could be. So I think that you guys are going to be shocked with what you're going to have in a couple of years. And when Teven was focused and into it and wanted to dominate, other players who were good, other good pass rushers, they couldn't get to our quarterback. I've seen him take off in practice when he gets fired up, and we run a screen play where the linemen are blocking downfield. He'll chase a corner or a safety all the way down the field, 30 or 40 yards, and stay in a good athletic position and knock them on the ground. So anytime that he wanted to play really well and dominate, and I think as he's matured mentally over the last year, that he can play at a really high level. He has to be challenged mentally. And hopefully, I missed his interview. My son had a baseball game last night, so I didn't see any of that. But if that's challenging him mentally based on being passed over by other teams, and he uses that to his advantage, that's going to really benefit the Chicago Bears. I've joked with Teven for years, but he made that transition in the last 12 months, in my opinion. And we've told him, Kevin, this is what it's going to take. Guys that are at the level that you're trying to get to, they're trying to feed their families. I mean, they're not just college kids out there on scholarship. And you're going to have to change your mental approach. And I think that he's making that change. He's not there yet. But as that staff there in Chicago learns to really push him, he has a freakish ability, and he's just real low key. And that's why I go back to, as he gets comfortable and these guys push him in a big way, he's going to train. He eats food. He eats right. He takes care of his body, doesn't abuse his body. And he's just different than a lot of very ego-driven athletes at our level and even in the NFL. I've been doing it for 31 years. Most of them are that way. Teven is not that way.
The reason why we might have overlooked it more at the time is because Gundy made it seem there like he was fairly confident that Jenkins had essentially turned the corner there, or had fully flipped the switch, or was past the point of going back. That yes, that the previous 12 to 18 months that he referenced there would seem to us like enough time that if he had sort of been able to do it that consistently from that point, that he should be more or less locked into that mindset from there and good to go. So we kind of brushed it off and said, yeah, I mean, the Bears are going to challenge him like that, and they're going to give him an opportunity to compete. And the Bears then should have a very, very talented offensive tackle. But now, given everything that's happened since and the context we have now, those sound like a lot bigger concerns and red flags now. Especially, I was thinking about it where when Mike Gundy says, just in the last year or 18 months, he's really flipped that switch. Tevin Jenkins was a 3-year starter at Oklahoma State. And actually, I think started a little bit as a freshman, but didn't start his full freshman season. But took over the starting lineup as a sophomore, started his whole sophomore and junior seasons, and then most of his senior season, and then left early to go to the NFL draft. He kind of opted out for the rest of that year. And I think there was a little bit of injury in there as well. So the fact that he started like maybe 2 full seasons before flipping that switch and taking it, I don't know if it's not that he wasn't taking it seriously, but maybe not taking himself seriously enough. It's hard to describe exactly what that is for Tevin Jenkins, but maybe it wasn't as permanent or cemented as Mike Gundy thought and as the Chicago Bears thought. So then you go through, last season he's got the injury and can't play until November, and then barely plays, and maybe didn't have the greatest experience with the Bears coaching staff. His weight was very high. The new regime comes in and says, hey, we need you to cut all this weight, and we're going to change up the scheme and forget everything you just learned, and we're going to have you do this, this, and this. We need you to fit in here. Maybe all of a sudden, he doesn't want to do that. Maybe he either got comfortable doing it a certain way or doesn't feel like, he's getting enough respect. I mean, Gundy talked about there that he doesn't really have an ego and that a lot of those other players tend to be more, which he said is a good thing. But I wonder if in this case, if Jenkins' lack of ego is a lack of, intrinsic motivation or drive to go out there and be the absolute best and compete and fight through and do everything the coaching staff is asking him to do, to put in the work to be the quality of offensive lineman that Gundy thought he could be, that the Bears thought he could be, that we've seen him be capable of doing. And now it seems like it's reached a certain point of damage. I don't know if it's irreparable harm, but it's definitely dicey at the time I'm recording this podcast. We'll kind of go through what could happen here for Tevin Jenkins. What might his trade value look like, and just kind of put together some of these pieces next on Locked On Bears. It's going to be hard to evaluate exactly what kind of trade value Tevin Jenkins can have here because of how little he's played and because of the injury situation last season and because it's hard to know how much other teams are going to know about his situation in Chicago. I mean, like, they can ask around and they can get some details, but are they going to have a full sense of what the situation might be, or are they going to be more scared than they need to be, or maybe not scared enough? Maybe it becomes easier to get him traded because maybe other teams don't realize to the full extent that he's whatever situation he's in. I mean, it's hard to get a complete sense there. You would think, kind of like what David Kaplan was saying earlier that we played the clip from, like, for the Bears, you would have a lot of motivation to figure this out, especially if the trade compensation isn't exactly what you want it to be. It's worth noting that this regime did not draft Teven Jenkins. I mean, obviously. And so to some extent, like, they're not worried about the sunk cost idea, right? They don't have to get their money back or their draft compensation back equally for Teven Jenkins for it to still be worth it to them because they didn't spend the second round pick. It doesn't look bad for Ryan Poles if he gets a day 3 draft pick for Teven Jenkins because he didn't draft Teven Jenkins. It looks bad for Ryan Pace if that's all Teven Jenkins is able to command at this stage of his career. But Ryan Poles has kind of talked before about how he doesn't really have to consider those things. He doesn't have to consider what the Bears paid for Teven Jenkins or Justin Fields or anybody or Khalil Mack because he didn't make those decisions to bring them in. He didn't pay those costs. So he's not operating as though, I have to get my second round pick back because it wasn't his second round pick. It certainly makes the Atlanta Falcons a prime trade destination for Teven Jenkins, considering Ryan Pace is in their front office and they've been collecting former Chicago Bears this season. They signed Jermaine Ifedi. They previously signed Cordero Patterson. They had Eddie Goldman before he retired. If you look at the Atlanta Falcons roster, there are legitimately like a dozen former Chicago Bears players, plus multiple coaches and front office people in there. It's really weird. So I would look for the Falcons as a potential team there. But the problem is, will the trade market be worth it enough for the Bears? I mean, if the Bears' other option is cut Teven Jenkins because they just don't want him in the building, then you'll take whatever you can get. But I feel like he's talented enough, and like these are adults and professionals that you'd think they could find some kind of way to work some kind of thing out with him in the building if the other option was to cut him. Because like you look back a couple of years ago, the Browns traded their center Austin Corbett, who was also a second-round pick, 33rd overall, so almost a first-round pick, after just it was like halfway through his first season, or early in his second season. He was struggling to make the lineup in Cleveland, second-round pick, traded to the Rams for a fifth just a year later, a few months ahead of where Teven Jenkins is now, but otherwise similar amount of like NFL playing experience. I don't remember specifically the same kinds of maturity issues with Austin Corbett necessarily. I'm not up on Cleveland Browns second round picks from 2019. I'm going to admit some shortcomings there, but you wonder if that might be the starting point in trade negotiations. Center versus offensive tackle. The tackles are going to have more value, so I don't know that fifth round pick is exactly what to expect, but don't expect the Bears to get a second round pick back for him. They're not going to get equal draft value from where he was. So then you have to ask yourself, say it's a fourth because of the value that a team might see in Teven Jenkins at tackle. I don't know. Is a fourth round pick next year more valuable to you than trying to work it out with Teven Jenkins? I think the Bears know better than we do how likely it is that they could work something out. But even if he spent this whole season on the bench and then you kind of try it again next offseason, and then at least if there's an injury, you still have him during the season if he's on the bench and you can throw him in there and say, oh, we need you. And even though we didn't think you were up to par with Larry Borom or whatever, you're still valuable depth for them at offensive tackle. So like unless they just really otherwise plan on cutting him, I don't know that a fourth or a fifth round pick. A fourth is getting close to me. A third I'd probably do in a heartbeat. A fourth it's borderline for me. I say it's borderline. A fifth doesn't feel like enough for me to just move on from Teven Jenkins and quit. A fourth is getting there. Could you package a fourth and a sixth or a fourth and a fifth or something like that? You could start to sweeten the deal a little bit, but it's tough and it's a little bit of a disaster. And again, I still think the bad look is more on Ryan Pace than on Ryan Poles, although there's still a bad look on the team for a whole, not being able to work this out with an otherwise clearly talented football player. And if he goes to another team and plays like a 10-year starting caliber offensive tackle like we kind of projected him coming out of the draft, that will then look even worse on the current Bears regime and the offensive line coach for not having been able to really work it out for him. Because this was supposed to be all around better for the offensive lineman, and it has not proven that way for Teven Jenkins. It probably lends some credence as to why they signed Riley Reif. The other aspect of this, Teven Jenkins is still on the physically unable to perform list. The Bears insist he's, quote, working through something with the trainer. And so if he's not healthy, supposedly, that could limit his ability to pass a physical in a trade. Although we all sort of suspect that he is not as injured perhaps as the Bears might want you to believe and could easily practice if he and the Bears both wanted him to, which does not currently seem to be the case. I will say Austin Corbett was traded from the Browns to the Rams, started for them for the next 3 seasons, won a Super Bowl, and got a big contract extension. So didn't work out for the Browns to trade their second-round offensive lineman that they weren't able to get in the lineup. Got a fifth-round pick for him, and he was great for another team and won them a Super Bowl. Feels like the Bears really need to work this out with Teven Jenkins, if at all possible, but I don't think they would resort to trading him for a perhaps limited draft compensation if they felt like they could still potentially trade him. We'll see what happens. Pads are just coming on at practice now, so that's what I thought his opportunity would be, to come back and practice and earn potentially a starting job once he can actually manhandle the opponent across from him instead of having to do this patty cake with no pads on that they've been doing through OTAs and training camp. I would have thought that's the moment he comes off the pup and starts to work his way back toward that starting lineup. But if they trade him, whatever happens, you can be sure we'll break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every day. Don't forget the Locked On Podcast Network is your team every day. So if you're looking for your second listen, Locked on Cubs, breaking down the trade deadline in the MLB. Locked on Bulls has you up to date with all the offseason action there. And Locked on Blackhawks as well has you covered with your Chicago sports across our podcast network. So check out some of those other shows. Come back tomorrow for more Bears training camp updates. And come back for another opportunity to bear down.